Good afternoon, it's John Thynne and Peter Haley, and we're both directors in that forensic division of Vincents. I thought we'd talk today on the top 10 pitfalls in undertaking business valuations. Our background is that we pair primarily business valuations in this division, so we're both valuing somewhere in the order of sort of 100 valuations a year, which under our controls we're seeing a fair few float through, but we also do a fair bit of critiquing other people's valuations. So today is really sort of going through a bit of that. Sorry, we'll back in 2 seconds, just having some technical difficulty. So that's a little background on us, which will all be in the slides when you get them afterwards. This next one, this was actually meant to be amusing when I read through it, but it's a bit long, so again we'll leave this to you to read a little bit later. So our top 10 pitfalls, and this is our opinion as to what the top 10 are from what we've actually seen out there. So going through these one by one is how we're planning on doing it, and just to give you a bit of a change of voice, we'll sort of alternate on the way through. These are not necessarily in any sort of order of importance. This is really how they popped into our mind. But the first one we've got here, looking forward, not backwards. A business valuation is all about what are the actual future cash flows going to be of the business and assessing the risk of those future cash flows. And one of the common mistakes we do find is that accountants will do their analysis of the past 3 years' trading history, do their adjustments and average the past 3 years. That process in itself is one of the tools we normally adopt. We look at the historical trading performance as a proxy for what the future is going to be, but it should never replace what you believe the future trading performance is going to be. And that's where a lot of the analysis is required, in that you need to actually interview the actual business and understand the actual environment that it trades within. For instance, things like, are there going to be any changes in the product? Are the clients, have you got any changes in your clients? So from a monthly analysis point of view, are there any new clients coming on or going, leaving the actual business? Suppliers, competitors, technological obsolescence, staffing, contracts, changes in contracts, new or old. Equipment, is there any capital expenditure required? Is it old? The premises, is that needed? Changes in the economy, the political environment is something we're seeing having quite a big effect in Queensland at the moment in businesses we're valuing. Changes in the owner's drive, and there's many more. But the big thing is we need to actually take those things into account and actually assessing what the actual future trading performance is going to be, and therefore the valuation.
Okay, number 2 on our list is lack of understanding of the drivers of the business. So, as John said, don't automatically just take the last 3 years, but where that is important is to get a feel for what the trends of the business are and what's sort of driving it. That's your first point of reference. But what you're really trying to understand with the drivers is, how did the business get to where it is? Is there one person who's really responsible for it all, and is that a big risk to the business? What are the key drivers? Is there one big customer, or are there many smaller customers? Probably one of the most useful tools you can do to get an understanding is actually get out there and see the thing and kick the tyres. So that's normally by way of a site visit. And it's amazing what pops up in the conversation just in terms of customers and how's business and things of that ilk that when you're out there talking to the business owner. And the other thing is, in trying to understand the drivers, are you just having a look at, as we said, the last 3 years' financial statements, for example, or is there more like a full due diligence type approach where you're looking at leases, customer agreements, contracts with customers, contracts with suppliers, and all those sort of things?
It's interesting with that one there. When you start seeing sort of the same businesses over and over again, you start seeing the same trends in businesses. And so it's quite interesting when you actually walk into, say, a mechanics business, how they physically set up their mechanics shop and how they physically set up their administrative area. You can quite often tell how they're trading just purely by looking at how they set their business up, as opposed to really needing to dive into the numbers. The third one we've got here is lack of understanding of the industry which the business trades within. Probably the classic example here is something like a personal injuries legal practice. They build up these mammoth practices. What happens if the regulatory government environment changes and they mandate damages on certain types of injuries? In that case there, the industry could disappear overnight. So that just highlights the example. You must understand that the industry which actually physically trades within. And there's lots of ways to physically do that, apart from looking at your existing clients, internet searches, changes in what products are actually physically out there, the regulatory environment, doing the internet searches again as to what's happening there. Is there an industry association you look at? How's the economy going to affect that industry? So what's the physical product? The economy from things like the monetary rate. We saw last week before the monetary rate dropped by another 0.25%. There's a reason it's dropped by 0.25%, in that the economy is not firing as we would hope. How's that going to affect the business actually physically going forward and the industry going forward? Political environment, once again. So it's very important to understand the industry that the actual business is trading within.
Again, that understanding the industry is often something that comes up when you're talking to the business owner. They'll often tell you what's happening out there. And as I say, if you've done, as John said, if you've done several other businesses, if the person doing the valuation is a specialist in valuations, odds on they've probably done a business the same or similar at some stage in the past. So you draw on those past experiences as well, and in particular those industry association inquiries, they're often quite good source of knowledge as well, just to get a feel for what's happening.
And as Peter said, one of the big ones we do there, the same when we understand the business, talking to the principals at the site visit. Again, you need to temper it with they potentially have a vested interest in the outcome, but they will highlight what the actual major issues are. Some of the other things might be things like IBIS reports or Dun & Bradstreet on the industry itself. There's lots of things that aren't physically available, benchmarks even, to start getting trends in the industry and what the norm is, and what the expected norm is going to be.
Okay, point number 4 is assuming the business is a going concern. So this is something that most reports just launch in and don't even really mention whether they've considered it or not. A lot of valuation reports that we review, and it's something that probably should be a fundamental question. So it might be obvious because the business is highly profitable, but again, if as John said, if you're in an industry that is potentially about to finish, so if you were a home insulator a few years ago, you might have had a perfectly viable business one minute, and then when the government's home insulation program was announced, you suddenly realise, well, I've suddenly got a business here that's only going to last for the next 2 years, because at the end of that 2 years, every house in Australia will be insulated, and I won't have a business anymore. So such things can happen overnight, by government announcement or some such thing, or new technology coming out. So it's something that should be at least considered, and working out whether there's not into perpetuity necessarily, but at least you've got a business that will exist into the medium to long term. And why that's important is, obviously, as going concern, a business and the assets that are used in the business will almost certainly have more value than in the event of a liquidation. So things such as plant and equipment that might be very specific have a value when they're connected to a business that is a viable going concern. But if that business is no longer viable, then those assets that are specific to the business won't have so much value. It's probably not such an issue with things like vehicles and whatever, but for example, I valued a couple of years ago a car wash that had been specifically built in a regional centre in Queensland. Unfortunately for the bloke who built it, someone else had the same idea. So previously there was one of the automatic car washes in town, and at about the same time 2 other people, unbeknownst to each other, both decided there was room for a second one. Trouble was, you ended up with 2 and 3. So suddenly, instead of one automatic car wash in town having a roaring trade, you had 3 that were all on the brink of going out of business and all trying to hang on to be the last one still standing. So in that event, you had a block of land with a purpose-built building on it, which cost $1 million to build, but because the business was questionable as a viable going concern, that building was potentially worth nothing. In fact, it could have cost you money to have it demolished so that you could actually build something on the site that was of use. So the other thing, if you do decide that the business is questionable as a going concern, you have to also then consider potential wind-up costs, redundancies for employees, lease terminations, and then, of course, the personal guarantees the directors may have given.
Also, it's important here to make sure you're not distracted by the historical trading performance. You know, quite often we see businesses in startup phase, their first 3 years, their trading performance is fantastic, and it's the old statistic, whatever the current one's sitting there, it's something like 72% or 80% of businesses fail within the first 3 years. They don't necessarily fail because of the poor product or poor business. It's quite often because they just actually outgrow themselves and they can't fund that growth. So it may be the last 3 years trading performance is really strong, but because of their growth, they can't fund their increase in debtors and they can't fund their increase in stock, and they've sort of outgrown their existing controls when they were small, were not sufficient to actually manage this business as they grew.
Or the owner might have been able to have his finger on the pulse when it was a smallish sort of business, and as it grows, and he just doesn't have that day-to-day knowledge of every little thing in the business, he starts to lose control, delegates to people who aren't as good at doing things as he is, and all those sort of factors come into play as well.
So just make sure that whenever you're doing this, you always need to know, our point number one, you're always looking forward. What's the future hold, not what the past. That's gone. Moving away from analysing the business and the industry, you need to actually make the call, obviously, that you need to value it. What methodology are you going to employ to value the business? There are many different methodologies out there. As you've been through our prior sessions and you probably know yourselves, the main areas they fall within earnings-based methodologies, asset-based methodologies, and industry rules of thumb. It may be that no one methodology is appropriate. You need to actually potentially look at a few. So it may be a business that's growing quickly. It may be when you look at the earnings-based methodology, capitalisation of earnings, and maybe compare that to discounted cash flow. It may be appropriate if you're looking at it may have profits on paper, but the outlook's questionable. You may look at earnings and asset base. Whichever it is, you need to actually apply it specifically to the actual case at hand. And always remember that there may be an industry rule of thumb. Now, although that in valuation theory may not be appropriate, in practice it may apply. You need to actually work out, are you trying to determine what the market value is under a theoretical base, or you're trying to work out what the market price is, what it actually physically trades for? And should you be looking at actually incorporating both of them into your valuation?
So some examples there are, as we said, everyone thinks, a lot of people, think that, you do a valuation just by taking the average of the last 3 years and multiplying by a factor of 3 or 4. Well, that's obviously a very basic methodology and may not be appropriate. And as John said, you should consider, so if you have got something that's in an industry that's in decline, that multiplying by a factor of 3 or 4, that's essentially a methodology known as the capitalisation of future maintainable earnings. And that methodology really assumes you've got a business that will be continuing into perpetuity. And by perpetuity, I think you're really meaning
foreseeable future.
Foreseeable future, which is probably the next 7 to 10 years at least. But if you've got a business that is unlikely to be around in that time, or certainly not in its current incarnation, I mean, all businesses evolve, but if they're going to evolve to something totally different over that time, if they survive, then adopting a methodology that assumes they'll still be going for 7 or 10 years in much the same way as they are today is not appropriate. And that's where you then have to bring in what's called a discounted cash flow, which tries to work out what the specific cash flows will be in each year until such time the business ends. And then, as John said, finally you need to do a check measure against that and find out if out there in the marketplace are people using some other totally different methodology, and therefore that's the one you should be using.
Some of the examples we've had here that probably highlight this issue is where you've actually got a business that historically has made well and truly more than what the commercial remuneration of the principals may be. we've had ones where they've made little demountable homes, they've done the plumbing for demountable homes, they've been a service provider in a specific industry, but they've got those contracts essentially because of their personal contacts, and quite often those personal contacts aren't assignable. You may be able to assign the business, but you'll not be able to keep the business. So ultimately, you've got to look at, is that methodology reflective of what's the risk associated with that business?
So leading on from that then is not applying the methodology correctly. So assuming the valuer has adopted the correct methodology. So in this slide, CFME stands for capitalisation of future maintainable earnings. So if you're going to adopt that methodology, you have to make sure you correctly calculate, firstly, the future maintainable earnings. So again, it's not just a matter of averaging the last 3 years. The capitalisation rate. So that's actually a rate that reflects the risks of the business. It's not just everyone else pays 3 times. You should specifically identify the risks of the business you're valuing. And then NTBA is the net tangible business assets. And that's probably the most common error out of those sort of 3 key factors that make up that methodology, is calculating what are the tangible assets, the debtors, the stock, the creditors that you need to run this business. So often it's based on, what's the balance at 30 June because that's the balance sheet we've got. But if you've got something like an accounting practice that, historically, because of the way the tax season runs, come 30 June, typically work in progress and debtors, because that's a quiet time of year, relatively, work in progress and debtors are relatively low. So if you looked at that same accounting practice in December, the level of debtors and work in progress might be 2, 3, 4 times higher than what they are at 30 June. So when you're working out what assets, what core assets do we need to run this business, you need to look at whether there's any seasonality in the business and not just assume that whatever's at 30 June is an appropriate level. So applying some of the other methodologies, if you use a DCF, a discounted cash flow, have to work out first of all the cash flows. Normally at the end of the period in which you're doing individual year cash flows, you come up with a thing called a terminal value, but to make sure that's calculated correctly. Again, the discount rate is similar to the capitalisation rate and reflects the risks of the business. What growth are you assuming is built into your cash flows? And finally, are you taking tax into account or not? Are your cash flows pre-tax or post-tax? Capitalised dividend stream is a methodology that's sometimes used where you've got a minority shareholding, so you might have 10% or less. So you've got no control. All you'll ever get out of it, and it's unlikely you could sell your shares, so you might own 10% of a family business that you don't actually work in. It's just a family arrangement. Every year you get some dividend checks. So trying to work out what that's worth, again, you need to try and work out what the underlying business will make as profits in the future and have available as dividends. Then you have to work out, what's historically, what sort of payouts have they paid out as dividends. They pay out 100% of profits, 50% of profits, whatever. And then again, you have to apply a capitalisation rate which reflects the risks. And finally, one of the other big mistakes you see commonly is someone's been instructed to value XYZ Proprietary Limited, but what they actually value is the business being run by XYZ, and then don't consider any other assets or liabilities owned by that company that are surplus to the operations of the business. So that's just a big one to watch out for.
Keep in mind, one of the big things there's a whole seminar just in this slide here. But things like the FME, again, we're talking about the future maintainable earnings. Future maintainable earnings does not equal the average of the last 3 years. It's all about the future. In theory, future maintainable earnings equals the next 12 months forecasted results. We rarely use that because we don't have that information. If we do, it's usually unreliable. But in theory, it's the next 12 months results. With the actual cash flows, one of the things you need to be very careful of, you're actually comparing like with like. So with your cash flows, are they before tax, after tax? And with the discount rate, is it before tax, after tax? How's that physical discount rate calculated? Is it a cost of equity or is it a weighted average cost of capital? All of those things need to be considered on the way through.
Sorry to, I know we're slipping into accountant's jargon here all the time, but that's just part and parcel of doing a valuation, I suppose. So then some of these factors are all cross over each other to some extent. So not considering the specific business risks is, goes hand in glove with lack of understanding and lack of understanding of the business and lack of understanding of the industry, etc. So, but it's important to realise each business has its own personality, and again, that second point there, you need to understand the key drivers of the business and the industry, and before you can undertake an analysis of the business risks involved. So what's happened, I know we keep harking on about this, but again, what's happened in the past does not necessarily mean that will happen in the future.
And what this also highlights, which we're about to get to as well in another slide, is that you can't value a business by looking at financial statements alone. If you are, you're doing a limited valuation. And what you need to do is actually get in behind the business and understand what makes it tick. So things like, does it have key staff that actually have a very special skill or referrer base? Key suppliers, if you lose that supplier, you no longer have a business. We had one of those a couple of years ago where this was actually providing a certain type of medical drug from a plant into this business, and we could no longer get that. There was only one producer and we no longer had that producer. The business stopped, but prior to that, it'd be making millions of dollars profit a year.
Or again, you might have the rights to import a particular product into Australia, and if that right ends next month or next year, what are your chances of renewing that agreement with the producer overseas, whoever that may be? And that's, you can have some risks like that are crucial to whether the business will even continue.
Obviously, the other ones are things like contracts. If you're in a construction business, it's good if historically made large profits, but it's all relying on the contracts it's got. So when you're valuing it, you need to look at the contracts. The product, is there technical obsolescence in there? The economy, where's it actually physically at? So again, we just keep coming back to, you need to fully understand where the business is sitting.
On the home stretch now, point 8, assuming the book value is the market value. So this relates to the tangible assets. So when you're trying to work out if there's any goodwill, you have to work out whether the value of the business as a multiple of its earnings is greater than the assets and liabilities needed to operate the business. So when you're doing that, as I mentioned the example before where you look at work in progress and debtors in an accounting practice, well, you might have a business that's heavily stock reliant. So the balance sheet might have $1 million worth of stock on it, but is that what it's really worth? Is there $200,000 worth of obsolete stock in there? So just because it's the value that's on the balance sheet doesn't necessarily mean that that's the value that it's really worth. And so you may not be able to do a stock take, you may not be able to do it, but it's a question that needs to be asked of the business owner, as to whether there are any issues with the stock, or are any of the debtors not collectible. So certainly the stock, you can do things like analyse last sale on particular items. You might go through and find your 10 biggest selling items or the 10 biggest stock holdings, and by reviewing the accounting records you can have a look and see, well, yeah, we're turning over those, we're still making sales, but you might have, of your $1 million worth of stock, there might be $100,000 worth of widget A. If you haven't sold any widget A's in 2 or 3 years, you'd have to question whether they've got any value. They might have been rendered obsolete by some new product. And the same with debtors. If you do an aged analysis of how old your debtors are, and the majority of them are in 120 days outstanding, then you've got to question whether those are collectible, or at least collectible in full.
That probably leads on to the next one, accepting information at face value. The financial statements you rely upon, there's various, as you understand, there's various accounting policies that can be employed, which are all above board. They're just basically an adoption of a certain type of policy for your stock, leases, cash versus accruals, recognition of expenses versus capital items. Each of these things, depending on the policy adopted, will actually affect the trading performance of the business. There could be things like one-off transactions. There could be deferral of repairs and maintenance programs. Whatever it might be, the financial statements may not necessarily reflect the true trading performance of the business. Those sort of things need to be considered. If you're using management accounts, you need to consider that manipulation may have actually been physically done for a certain purpose, that you're able to do it on the way through a financial year, that once the external accountants looked at it, that may change. So again, be very aware of what's physically there. We said before that it's important to do a site visit and to actually interview the principals. You can gain a lot of information there. But always remember that the principals you're talking have a vested interest in the outcome of the actual valuation, whether they want it higher or lower, will depend on how they actually sell their business. You know, the outlook is poor, the outlook is fantastic, and there's a whole range of things to actually physically justify that.
So if you go and talk to a business owner who's trying to get some finance to buy some new equipment, he'll be telling you a nice rosy story, but if you go and see him 6 months later when he's getting divorced, you'll probably get a totally different story.
And it is amazing, you know, we do a lot of personal injuries in the office, and it's amazing the odds on, probably 95% of the actual plaintiffs we have through here will come in and say, look, the business was always on a huge growth spurt, and we were about to strike gold, and then we had our injury, and as a result our business has failed. And we look at the financials, and sure enough you can see the indications in there. But if you look behind that, it's very easy to manipulate to actually achieve that result.
And this is one thing, you know, where looking at the last 3 years is appropriate and is very useful. You get a feel for the trends and what's happening in the business, and then, you know, does that fit with what you're being told?
I valued an equipment. It wouldn't be equipment hire; it's equipment hire portal, as a way to put it. A couple of years ago, a year ago, and essentially what happened, because of the actual what appeared to be the mining industry, this portal, which was people who owned mining equipment, earth move equipment, could put their equipment on the actual website, and people who wanted to hire it would actually jump onto it and rent it from that, much like a carsales.com. But what we actually found was happening was that given the actual mining industry and the actual back-offered mining industry, that the earth-moving people were looking for ways to actually hire their equipment, so they were jumping at anything, and this website was one of the things. But actually looking forward, most of these guys, or a lot of these guys, have now gone belly up. So the actual equipment is disappearing, and the actual future of this portal is questionable.
Okay, and finally, after you've done 1 to 9 and made sure that's okay, at the end of the day you've got to sit down and say, well, is the value determined reasonable? So the person might have looked forward, you know, done all the research, got an understanding of the business, the industry, correctly worked out the business as a going concern, adopted an appropriate methodology, applied that methodology correctly, considered all the risks, looked at all the book value versus market value of all the assets, and, you know, was critical of the information provided and have come up with a number as to the value of the business. But at the end of the day, you've still got to say, is that number realistic out there in the marketplace? Because normally what you're trying to determine is market value. So, for example, if you're valuing a medical practice in a regional town, and you come up with a number, an answer that's saying, well, someone will buy this thing for 4 times 1 year's profit, you've got to question that, because there'll come a point in the marketplace where someone will say, I won't pay that, I won't buy that. It'll be cheaper and easier for me to just go in, because I know I'll get a full patient list within 12 months. I'll be full and I'll be making the same sort of money within 12 months. So why would I buy your practice for 4 years profits? I'm going to start my own up. Yeah, I might struggle a bit for the first 6 or 9 months, but within a year, I'll have a full book. I couldn't be any busier. So why would you pay that? And they're the sort of things you need to, what would someone actually pay out in the marketplace? And quite the opposite might apply as well, where, in theory, the business may not be valued at very much, but for whatever reason, there might be more demand out there. So this was probably pharmacies going back 3 to 5 years ago. There was a lot of demand for people to try and buy pharmacies. So the old, sort of rule of supply and demand pushed prices up because there were more buyers than there were sellers. But fundamentally, the prices being paid were too much. The profitability of it just didn't back it up. So on the slide there, we've got some of the issues you should really consider, and if you can get market transactions, all the better to try and find out what people are actually paying out there, which of course is always quite difficult in the small, medium business market. But anyway, that's basically all we had today.
We've got our half an hour up. Look, thank you for joining us. We've obviously covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time. So the slides will be available. So if anyone has any questions, by all means, shoot in some questions or give us a call. Our details will be on the slides. So thank you.
Thank you for tuning in.